Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jay Dellecave, and I'm an assistant professor of the practice in theater arts and performance studies here at Brown, and also a member of the curatorial team for Queer Durations. So it is my honor to gather with everyone here today and welcome you to Lineages of Duration and Queer Reciprocity in the work of Julie Tolentino. Following yesterday's panels and performances, I have been thinking a lot about gaps and intervals and continuities and how gatherings such as Queer Durations become part of how we know each other through time and space and part of how we weave our lives, stories, thoughts, and ideas together. And also how we press up against what is not working and relish in, scream at, mourn, and celebrate despite all that is in this particular moment, as was brought up in ideas around curatorial care in the panel this morning. So I just want to start by asserting that these kinds of gatherings at this particular moment are vital. And start with my thank yous for everyone who helped to make Queer Durations happen. So first, Brown Arts Institute Ignite Series, Department of Theater and Performance Study of Theater Arts and Performance Studies, Department of American Studies, U.S. Latino Studies Fund, Pembroke Center Faculty Seed Program, my fellow curatorial team members, Leon Hilton, Thea Quere Tagle, J.D. Stokely, Melissa Kievman, our producer, Maxime and Joshua, members of the producing team, and many, many production staff here at the BAI. Also, big, huge thanks to the invisible workers who clean our spaces and cook our foods in order for us to gather and be here today. There we are going to continue to durate today. So a couple of pitches for what else is happening following this event. We have two amazing performances this evening, XSCN and Elliott Reed. We're nearing capacity for both of these events, so be sure you arrive early, particularly for the XSCN event that's happening following this panel. There is extremely limited capacity, and doors will open a half an hour early at 3. So if you really want to see that performance, I recommend going directly from here to there. Tomorrow is our last day of Queer Durations with featured performing artists in conversation with Tavi and Nyong'o. We also have Brooke O'Hara, Sharon Hayes, and Heather Love in conversation. And Queer Durations culminates with Dorian Wood's performance tomorrow night. So betwixt in between these events, yes, you caught the performance studies terminology, if you're in the cult anyway. Be sure to check out the performances in the Cohen Gallery with Julie Tolentino students, who she's been working with this entire semester here at Brown, as well as the large selections of films curated by J.D. Stokely. There are shorts and feature lengths, and they're installed throughout the Granoff in the interior stairwells that run through the center of this building. We call them living rooms. They're more like Judy Jetson meets a dorm room. You'll see them as you go up the stairs. Lastly, I just wanted to say on behalf of this group of scholars and the curatorial team at large, what an honor it has been to have Julie Tolentino on campus with us this semester. Julie, from the deepest place in my heart, thank you for the work that you do and all that you bring to the people and places you touch. So there's 4 of us that are each going to present papers today. We'll go in the order of Leon Hilton, followed by Summer Kim Lee, Leticia Alvarado, and I'll go last, Jay Dellecave. Following our presentations, we'll have a moment to respond to each other, and then hopefully we'll have time to get a question or two from the audience. Full bios for each of the speakers on stage can be found in the program. And please note that the slides that will accompany today's talks include nudity and piercing. Yay. So without further ado, I will hand things over to Leanne.
Okay, this is called Notes for JT, and there's two quotes at the beginning. We didn't need dialogue, we had faces then. The punctum of a photograph is that accident which pricks me, but also bruises me, is poignant to me. The almost perfect letter S, formed by the negative space between your lips. The index finger, is it supposed to be bending that far? Even here, the dancer, a choreography of the index finger. The loose knitwear, the line of skin where the buzz cuts end. The hoop earring. Who's speaking when Grand Fury speaks? My lips, your lips, George H.W. Bush's lips. Lipstick traces, lip sync for your life. Can one lip read another? Are the lips a grave? Can you smell a photograph? Click Club NYC and Meet join forces. A healing crown of thorns, a massive gay spectacle. Performing surgical stigmata. A procession of dyke fag extremity. Celebrate in a scandalous, raw, sexy, barbaric surrounding. Dudes and daggers. Porno for homos. The plus sign. Addition, I suck at math. Positive, the slash, the ampersand. Who will pick up if someone calls the number? No, really. 212-529-3300. Can someone try it? The almost right angle bend between the thumb and the index finger. Look, the leather already there. Maybe the leather was first. The consistency of a sacrament. The stretch of one kind of animal skin against another's. The glorious perversity of a leather corset. The horribly frank, practical tenderness of a medical glove worn as a ritual garment. A signification transformed through the sheer force of charisma. A prophylaxis that becomes something else beyond the ornamental. Soft spot under the chin, below the tongue, swallowing, surrendering, tipping back to receive the blessing. When a young person looks up the word queer in a dictionary, this should be the photograph that greets them. The Renaissance composition, the absorption of everyone's attention, the playful interleaving of gazes, everyone looking somewhere different. Already you and Pigpen in syncopation. The oscillation, sorry. The oscillation of our attention between you both. Foreground and background, again and again. The looping thread made by our, wow, I did not expect this, okay. Our looping back and forth between you, already the thread that will eventualize in the molten gold filament. A healing crown of thorns, an offering, a benediction, a single contortion of the face that is at once a wince, a grimace, and a laugh. A quotation from St. Teresa of Avila, quote, during this agony, The soul is inundated with inexpressible delights. Those lucky goldfish. Norma Desmond said, "We didn't need dialogue, we had faces then." Maria Falconetti in Dreyer's Joan of Arc could never. Does it hurt to be blessed with such a face? Is it itself a kind of cage that your work is always trying to escape? Another choreography of the finger and now the hand, the electric blue of the needle, a hospital blue radiated beyond anything that color blue could have dreamed about in the life that it was made for. Let us listen to what some psychoanalysts have to say. Quote, "The beautiful has the effect, I would say, of suspending, lowering, disarming desire. The appearance of beauty intimidates and stops desire." Jacques Lacan. Quote, "In our mutual fascination with the beautiful object, we come under the sway of the scopic drive, and in subsequently renouncing our imaginary relation to the object, we satisfy the drive's requirement for non-satisfaction, and again re-enter the symbolic by assuming the other's desire as our own." Maria Scott. Quote, "Every time the gaze falls upon us, we face a psychic rupture." Lauren Berlant writes, "I see sex as an arena where a cluster of excited inclinations to discover a displace within attachment is played out. It is a place where the trembling of one's penetration by relationality is always revealed, even when no one else is in the room. It is a scene in which one enjoys the risk of moving through a field of ambivalence, resistance, and interest." How to escape from the terrible fate of having a face. Dismantling the face means, to quote, "No longer look into the eyes, but to swim through them, to close your eyes, to close our own eyes, and make your body a beam of light, moving at ever-increasing speed." That's from Deleuze and Guattari. In the voids, we slink away from the demand to always be ourselves. Leather stitched in gold filament, from the face to the beam of golden light, the stream of molten and unbearable sweetness. Kissing doesn't kill. Greed and indifference do. We didn't need dialogue then. Sorry. We didn't need dialogue. We had faces then. Thank you.
Okay, hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Just wanting to echo my gratitude to Julie, to Leon, to the curatorial team for letting me be here and respond to work that I feel like has just been sticking to us, in us for a long time. So sweetness as taste and temperament can overwhelm the necessity of nourishment, the niceties of tact and decorum. I want to think about the sweetness of Julie Tolentino's durational performance, Honey, in relation to a state of spoilage, of being spoiled, which does not shore up, affirm, or make whole the body or the self, so much as damage it over time, causing it to burst, leak, turn. Someone spoiled wants more of everything, someone's attention, too much of a good thing, a sweet thing. The spoiled might initially be in pursuit of an ideal, but due to overzealousness, such pursuits can lead to an ideal's ruin. I'm interested in duration as the time of wanting too much for too long, as the time wherein an ideal is spoiled, which is ultimately what must happen to an ideal. But to spoil an ideal is to also risk ruining something for the rest of us, leaving one open to the accusation that one is only acting for one's own selfish ends. I'm interested in these sweet selfish ends, which I think actually have no end, constituted instead by their ongoingness. The world does not revolve around you. My mother used to tell me this when I was younger, particularly when I took too long to come set the table for dinner and eat. For Freud, one of humankind's, quote, outrages against its naive self-love, end quote, is the shift from a Ptolemaic to Copernican cosmology. Children are confronted with the realization that the world does not revolve around them in the same way that the sun does not revolve around the earth. The I must realize that it is, quote, not even a master in its own home, end quote. Laplanche describes this cosmological shift as, quote, the first narcissistic wound, end quote, of humankind. However, Laplanche points out that this cosmological shift in psychoanalysis is not seamless, but, quote, an alternation between relapses into Ptolemaism and resurgences of the Copernican, end quote. People shift back and forth, gravitating towards the strangeness of the other within the self, but also the strangeness of other people. The revolution of Copernican then is never complete. The narcissistic wound never heals. It remains open, and so does the self. I like to think that in Tolentino's Honey, the world revolves around her at the same time that she is pulled into the orbit of other people, alternating between different kinds of strangeness. Tolentino's collaborator, Pigpen, pours 50 pounds of honey into her mouth for anywhere between 3 to 5 hours. Together, they have performed honey at several gallery and museum events and conferences at universities in and outside of the US. While Tolentino pulls our attention as the figure taking in all the honey, Pigpen has the power to determine how much Tolentino can take. In the cosmology of the performance, two figures, like planets, turn toward one another. Each face their own decentering and reopening, given and giving over to the other. There is no closure and consolidation of the self, only its spoilage through an orientation to oneself that must bend towards another again and again. Tolentino's work as an artist, dancer, choreographer, and activist is shaped by her community, formed out of rage, grief, and survival during the AIDS crisis, as well as by a changing New York City, which, due to Rudy Giuliani's Quality of Life campaign in the 90s, cracked down on porn theaters, clubs, cruising spaces, and other public sites vital to queer nightlife and sex. All that Tolentino's body can withstand, lend, and hold is done with the exertion, effort, and trust required to commit to loved ones, here and not, and the collective memory forged with and between them. Tolentino's body is pushed, pierced, bound, and made to shed blood, done by or on behalf of those she works to be in relation to. She inhabits and embodies the pain and difficulty of loss in her community, but also the pain and difficulty of staying within it, of keeping companions close. In her practice, she commits to being with and around others who she might harm and who might harm her. There is no keeping score, only receiving and giving, taking and inflicting, letting in and letting out. Tolentino's Honey allows me, briefly and selfishly, to recall my time as a graduate student when I saw Tolentino and Pigpen perform Honey twice, in 2012 at an academic conference at New York University, and in 2013 at another conference at Stanford University. This allows me to think about the durational life of the student too, who always has more to learn. It is my hope that there is something to be learned from the spoiled as a site of pedagogy through Tolentino, constituted by that movement between the Ptolemaic and Copernican, within a classroom thrown off its axis from time to time, revolving around a teacher like Tolentino and what she knows, then revolving around what students think and come to learn. Maybe this is what Barbara Johnson meant when she told her students that, quote, teaching is teaching people to think as themselves, which means the teacher has to try to think as herself, end quote. A class orbits around what the teacher is thinking in herself, and the students interrupt that orbit, causing the teacher to be led astray, to be pulled into their orbit, into their own thinking they do as themselves. In the performances of honey that I've seen, Tolentino stands upright with her head tilted back with mouth open. Pigpen sits 10 feet above her on a hunting blind where they squeeze honey from condiment bottles onto a gold thread that draws a line from Pigpen's hand to Tolentino's mouth. The thread is a tether and a pathway of communication, like a telephone wire or a string between two tin cans that can send messages from mouth to ear, from hand to mouth. Tolentino describes the drops of honey as little globes. In an interview with Alex Fialho, Tolentino explains, quote, "There's just one action, craft the globes, and I just wait with my mouth open for the honey to drop into my mouth," end quote. Pigpen crafts the globes like small planets traversing their allotted path along the thread into Tolentino's mouth. Following Laplanche's line of thought, perhaps these crafted globes of honey contain messages that Tolentino and Pigpen communicate to each other in excess of language and speech. After all, her mouth and throat are full, wherein the excess materializes as that dripping decadence of honey. Tolentino and Pigpen work at handling and consuming that excess. Pigpen focuses on the pacing of feeding, and Tolentino focuses on waiting, remaining open to more honey that will come. Tolentino understands her role as one of a supplicant. She tells Fialho, quote, "My head is in a receiving position. My mouth is in a receiving position. My mouth is open, but it's in the shape of an O, which is both an ecstatic, orgasmic, receiving state, but it's also the exact state of one's mouth when you die," end quote. Tolentino is ready to receive pleasure and sweetness that comes with finitude. The vitality of a body with an appetite converges with that body's demise. The orbit of the O, of the mouth, is the site of jouissance. Tolentino's open mouth is a plea and a posture of unconditional acceptance. Tolentino states, quote, "I am trying to articulate the kind of directness of communication between people and the loss of information, the stickiness of it, the libidinal quality and the kind of sensuality of what communication can be like or what communication offers. And also, I think that I'm expressing the opposite of that, which is the difficulty of being able to speak, the distance between people, the ways that you can hear what you want to hear, like it can just be a one-way receipt, the way that the thing that you're crafting kind of ends up in a whole other state," end quote. In honey, communication is made possible through the practice of feeding a lover honey for hours, of being fed honey for hours. What is communicated can be direct, like the straight line of thread, yet there is also the possibility of a message getting stuck or distorted, leading to a whole other state that could be called miscommunication, or else the difficult challenge of a new mode of communication. Tolentino and Pigpen's communication through globes of honey on that line, of working to sync up with each other's timing that requires Pigpen to decide how much Tolentino can take, are reminders that love and the processes of repair that encompass all that love promises come with the damage of the spoiled, the honey that falls and fills, the struggle and suffering and wanting and receiving too much, stuck in the golden thick of communication and what could go wrong. In preparation for Tolentino's performance in New York in 2012, a couple of graduate students on the conference organizing committee, myself included, went to Queens to buy samples of different kinds of honey at Greek grocery stores. In preparation for the performance, Tolentino needed to taste and select specific kinds of honey. She chose 2 different kinds of honey, one with a better taste to start, not too sweet, followed by another kind with a less distinct taste to be used towards the end. I liked knowing that Tolentino's taste was a necessary part of the performance. In addition to nourishing and conditioning her body by eating chicken for protein prior to the performance, she also anticipated what her body might like during the performance, what she can tolerate but also taste, what kind of consistency and texture could create the globes she could consume. Durational performance puts pressure on distinctions between capacity and debility, control and powerlessness. Under constraint, Tolentino's taste preference asserts her skill and technique required for the performance, as well as some small possibility of her pleasure and assertion of desire in having Pigpen feed her the honey she chose to swallow. At the same time, Tolentino explains, quote, "Other things that are happening is that the sweetness is probably the least thing that I am thinking of, because it's almost as if the honey starts to move past my palate and it moves just directly into my, it's more about it going into my body and also falling out in a way, and also covering the palate and the taste buds and the place where you would actually taste the honey," end quote. Such preparation and selection are not wholly about Tolentino exercising her agential capacity, but that capacity's limit, where the inability to be able to taste after so many hours engenders a different relationship to her body and embodied pleasure. My preoccupation with sweetness and what I imagined to be Tolentino's preoccupation with it is contradicted by the moment Tolentino describes, when sweetness becomes the least thing, and what comes first is the matter of it going on and into her body, covering the place where you would actually taste. Sweetness is overtaken. This pleasure in the consumption of too much honey is found in that inappropriate quantity of more, which, as Yana Hawkins writes, unfolds, quote, in the excess of its bounded social role, end quote. Owen considers the unknowable quantity of more in the relationship between asexuality's non-sexual pleasures, the sentiment that one would rather have cake more than sex, and fetism's sexual pleasures from feeding. In both contexts, as well as in honey, more becomes, quote, an anti-hierarchical framework to think about pleasure and appetite, end quote. More honey becomes honey that relishes for too long as a quantity of the spoiled, which in its inappropriateness seeks pleasure from and in its own deviance. Tolentino's performance deviates from the ameliorative properties and palatability of honey. For me, it also spoils, in my own thinking, familiar, nostalgic, healing Asian American narratives that center on food and the relations and social worlds it affords. I don't deny the importance and pleasures of such worlds, nor our relationship to them or our appetites for them, but the timing of the tense yet luxurious relation between Tolentino and Pigpen alters such narratives, interrupting them with different enactments and expressions of nurturance and love and what it feels like to be full but not whole. When watching honey, either standing or sitting down on the floor to watch, walking away and coming back again, I think about what it is that we do in our attempts to make amends for the kinds of harm or disappointment we might cause by not showing up when someone is trying to feed us or by having to eat too much when we do. What sticks is the feeling of a disproportionate appetite, the honey accumulating on the thread, clinging in and on Tolentino's throat, her face and body. This stickiness jams up idealized notions of abundance, perverting plenitude with scenes of overconsumption desirous of another's company for one's sweet selfish ends. Acts of feeding someone more, the act of eating more of what someone feeds you, are bound to produce the lavishness of waste. Tolentino cannot eat all the honey Pigpen pours, and as the performance continues, the honey drips onto her arms, shoulders, chest, face, and legs, pooling beneath her feet. She becomes a glistening golden figure, glowing with the surplus of her spoilage, a body encased and suspended between preservation and saturation. This past October, I, among many here, got to see Tolentino and Pigpen perform Honey for the last time. At the performance's end, we watched in silence, breath held, as Pigpen climbed down from above, took Tolentino's hands, wrapped her in a blanket and towel, and led her to a chair, where, washed in light, she glowed as she wiped her face with a towel. The excess was deserted honey, left to pool in a shallow bin, commingling with Tolentino's trace. When given and taking more that becomes too much, there is the matter of letting go, the matter of golden dregs. I think this is what, over the years, I have learned from Tolentino's sweet selfish ends, lying in the glimmering path of her orbit and everything that revolves around her for a time. Thank you.
I just want to start with a quick thank you to the organizers, and especially to Leon for his invitation to have me reflect on Julie's performance of Honey. I'm not sure if you knew at the time, but I had never seen Honey and was actually not super familiar with Julie's work. So I really tried to focus on, or to have my comments today reflect my response, just what it was to view that performance. I was not prepared to feel grief, to think of grief work, watching a honey-cloaked Julie Tolentino, arms sloped away from her torso as her tremulously cocked wrists offered a sonic stigmata. The distorted wails of Butch King, Chela Vargas, sampled and mixed across the tape recorders in her hands. The single amber light positioned above her, an ambient opposite and complement to the rigid black pyramidal structure that held her collaborator, Pigpen, that gently cradled her when arching back to catch a break from the constant stream of honey, frames not just a deepening tenebrism with the passing of time, but also homes audience focus on the durational exercise in its final staging here at Brown on October 17th. I was not ready for the Marianist vespers to suffuse the performance, like viscous sfumato radiating past the ascension portal created by the stage light under which Tolentino writhed in what I was sure was the agony and ecstasy of highly gendered durational martyrdom. Chicana feminists have trained me, though, to regard Marianismo queerly as complexly embedded within an anti-colonial genealogy of embodied exercises of survivance. Reflecting on her performance of Honey in an oral history interview for the Smithsonian, Tolentino echoes my own sense of an encounter with the unexpected. Quote, "I think that the piece really offers something that I don't mean to happen," she shares. "There is some suffering in that piece, but I'm not performing. I'm not affecting the performance of it. I'm just allowing the real thing that's happening to happen." I think that a really important aspect of the way that I'm also thinking about these challenging and slightly masochistic performances is that I'm working with them. I'm not just demonstrating them as something I can do. The exercise then offers a conscientious, active, and ongoing withstanding, a coloring of the durational I read through the anti-colonial, harnessing the collective body against history's normative investments through the management of a care of the self. The durational serves as an invitation to think with the aesthetic category of the sublime, an emotive sight that frustrates reason, at once pleasurable and repulsive, affectively proximal to unknowing, awe and wonder, and capable of blurring into terror. The sublime's ambivalent complexity is triggered for some art historians by formlessness, a paradoxical frame made tangible by the temporal drag of durational performance. Described as a negative pleasure, the sublime for me has previously been a site rife for theorizing abjection to understand aesthetic responses to minoritized subjection. I was prepared, after Leon's invitation and a cursory description of Honey, to invoke that heuristic. I had been expecting to experience literal desire-tinged revulsion within a sublime extension and collapse of time, a collapse and terror. Sitting for the 3-hour performance, a soft honey fragrance intermingled with the smell of other people and the smellful things that they carried, but ebbed as the room filled. There was not enough of an olfactory immersion to transport me to identification in synesthetic confusion via gag reflex, but there was a tenuous continuity that required my commitment and recommitment to attention, facilitated by dwelling, after J.M. De Leon's reading via Sayanai, in sublimity, in recognition of the aesthetic experience in which astonishment is paradoxically united with boredom, and through sublimity to regard the minor registers of abjection through discomfort or disgust and its management through a structured care of the self. In the third volume of History of Sexuality, Foucault elaborates a theory of the care of the self as social and relational, a kind of, quote, soul service, which includes the possibility of a round of exchanges with the other in a system of reciprocal obligations, end quote. Sitting in sublimity, my attention as an audience member of Honey was drawn to the structures of support that made the work possible. The carefully curated and executed care of Tolentino's body, her physical and artistic bodies, within a durational exercise that deployed a multiply secreted, curative, and corrosive substance. It feels important to note, as my co-presenters have, the intimate act of feeding at the core of Honey. the entrusted pacing of the stream to Pigpen, as well as the enlisting of assistants that made visible, if demurely, the instructed care of Tolentino's body and directed replenishment of the bottles that helped maintain a measured flow of honey. As important, I was conscious of the audience in our reciprocal obligation to hold the performance in co-presence with our attention. A live performance element that for Tolentino is linked to the archival capacity of the body. Tolentino has long conveyed her practice as an archival one, especially committed to archiving a queer of color undercommons, its gender nonconformativity, interclass conviviality, and survivance in the face of governmental negligence of the AIDS pandemic. As Andrea Lepecki explains it, for Tolentino, quote, "The body is the privileged archival site that diverts notions of the archive away from a documental deposit or bureaucratic agency dedicated to the mismanagement of the past," end quote. Gathered for what was advertised as the final performance of Honey, the collective body of the audience is called to archive the performance and joined by grief for its loss, for Tolentino's diminishing capacity to reenact those performances of queer abjection, attenuated by reciprocal obligation of the audience to hold the performance. For Sandra Ruiz, grief work engenders an ensemble of affinities, resonances, and invitations for reckoning with the stain of enduring historical violence across sites and subjects under siege. Accessed through Tolentino's vulnerability, this grief then serves to cohere a commons in the audience as Tolentino's cultivation of the self is intensified and valorized in a reparative gesture. I am here echoing Jose Munoz and the artist now Bustamante to similarly claim that Tolentino's performance practice engages and reimagines what has been a history of violence, degradation, and compulsory performance. And that, quote, "For female artists of color to engage this field is not only historically loaded, but it is also extremely vulnerable making," end quote. Even without this framing of an other history of intercultural performance, Tolentino's vulnerability is underscored throughout in the use of subtle armature to provide occasional reprieve from reclining, while underscoring the possibility of falling backwards. In the delivery of dampened towelettes to wipe her eyes, surely sensitive to the acidity of the honey. In the slow slip of her leather sheath we know will eventually expose her. In the small adjustments she makes to prevent slipping on the accumulating honey. In the assistance Tolentino receives as she departs the small honey-filled plinth at the end of the performance and is escorted away toward a kettle of warm water and container of antacids. And in sensing that Tolentino is, as I said earlier, working with what is happening in the performance, the suffering, the slightly masochistic. But it is through grief work that vulnerability is shared out, the emoted affect in a negative register, the discomfort, the disgust, sublimity, that are the minor registers of the abject alongside grief, does not simply flow out of us, to quote Munoz, but instead tells us a story about our relationality to others, but also to groups. We feel a sense of belonging to groups that inspire a sense of unbelonging. We are all weighed down, burdened by emotions that are radiated toward us. And it is through this distribution, through vulnerability and collective care of the self, a revolt of conduct in the field of embodiment, that Tolentino's archival project is extended for an upending of state control over ways of living and remembering the disappeared. Thanks.
Thank you, Leon, Summer, and Letty. Duration, Empire, and the Insides of the Body in Julie Tolentino's Honey. The clarity and precision of Tolentino's external muscular skeletal movements lingers in my memory And I here am also referring to the 2024 version performed here about 6 weeks ago. Their hours-long, perfectly stable backbend, open and extended chest, twisting, never resting arms, rotating and tightly gripped hands, slow, steady, and seductive shifts of weight, firmly planted feet, glistening torso, O-shaped mouth, sticky and globular eyelashes. The event was difficult, complex, one of the most beautiful performances I have ever seen, disturbing, not neat, exquisitely crafted, smelly, sensual, evocative. I could go on. And honey does go on and on and on for hours. And also beyond the discrete act of the performance, extending into the audience's imaginations, and here to the topic of our panel today. The external shapes, contours, textures, and composition, also soundscape, installation, set, other performers of Tolentino's Honey were stunning in and of themselves, yet there was another more subtle and perhaps more obvious bodily choreography in Tolentino's Honey: swallowing, spitting, digestion, and finally excretion. Additionally, we could, and Tolentino does, discuss endorphins and other hormonal actions, glandular, lymphatic, enteric, and circulatory systems. So in my remarks today, I will look at how Tolentino's choreography of the inside of the body was where one of the most profound intersections of Tolentino's art and 21st century US imperialism occurs. So to look at the insides of the body builds on a long history of practice and scholarship that highlights the resistance to imperialism through art. I am not going to list any of that here. For the past several years, my own scholarship has focused on how embodied arts that engage the insides of the body expose 21st century US imperialism in potent ways that proffer more complex and nuanced understandings. And this theoretical move beyond the bounds of the container of the body, to use my book language, to activate the insides, disrupts the Cartesian split present in our analyses and ways of thinking through bodies in art practice, where there's still often an overemphasis on the shapes of the muscular skeletal system, the body, or conversely, a focus on affect, feelings, and cognitive process, which we relegate to just the minds. And I would argue both are both, again, for another time. Embodied, inside the body oriented artworks offer a framework beyond the Cartesian split, and as a result expose various, often more complex, more subtle, or more obvious standing in plain sight aspects, again, of this 21st century US imperialism. And I think this imperialism takes many forms. I'll name just a few: declared war abroad, military bases abroad, funding for and support of military operation for other empires, including other settler colonial projects, ongoing settler colonial occupation in the United States, ongoing structural racism, cultural hegemony. Again, I could go on and on and on. In the 1993, and here I'll re-evoke this idea of interval that has been playing here because I found myself quoting folks from the mid-90s, which was another very politicized moment in my own life. So in the 1993 classical post-colonial text, Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said describes the more subtle and durational aspects of empire. Said makes the distinction that in previous centuries, imperialism manifested as direct colonialism that was defined by a dominant metropolitan center which ruled distant settlements, rendering colonialism as a, quote, consequence of imperialism. Said proposes that imperialism has shifted from this direct mode and method and instead, quote, lingers where it has always been, in a kind of general cultural sphere, as well as in specific political, ideological, economic, and social practices. For Said, the multifaceted ways that imperialism lingers is infused into a myriad of art practices, and he specifically takes up literature, which are unable to separate or have autonomy from empire even as they assert themselves as doing such. Instead, Said is less concerned with the seemingly dichotomous connection between imperialism and art, but instead emphasizes these, quote, connections will emerge from their explicit places within the enveloping setting empire. And I'll say that again, within the enveloping setting empire. Thus, empire and the art that resist empire are in relation or relational. Both empire and art that resists it are also enveloped in the actual time and place of empire, and it is precisely from these connections that dynamical and complex historical relations and resistances can emerge. So, digestion, spitting, and swallowing. Tolentino's Honey touches on an aspect of contemporary imperialism that bind all of the facets of 21st century US imperialism together: capitalism and its hungry ghost, consumption. Tolentino's Honey stages consumption and digestion as an excessive, elevated, decorated, erotically charged, and relational, durational performance. Beneath the surface structures of the body, the insides are not fully knowable. The insides of the body are unseen, mysterious, invisible, and invisibilized. Some of these bodily actions are swallowing, spitting, the enteric gut nervous system, endorphins, and other hormonal processes. And there are even more if we were to discuss cellular levels. And I'll just have you notice for yourself when I say swallow, if you notice yourself swallow. Again, relationality. In a 2018 interview with Macarena Gomez Barris, Tolentino discusses the choreography of the throat necessary for the performance of Honey. Tolentino describes a slight push and pull forward and backwards of the motion of swallowing, and how the actual physiological action requires a simultaneous ingesting and expelling of the honey. In other words, in order to swallow, to digest the honey itself, Tolentino must simultaneously expel the honey from their mouth. Spitting and swallowing also evoke sexual acts, sensuality, and the excess of pleasure. In the final choreography of Honey, one that happens far past the engagement with the audience, the honey will be excreted from Tolentino's body. And here I think of sweat, shit, piss through the skin, and on and on and on. Experiential and somatic practices such as Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen's Body Mind Centering, or BMC, again, a mid-90s text, help to explain the invisible choreography going on inside the body during Honey. Linda Hartley, BMC practitioner, writing in The Wisdom of the Body Moving, discusses the digestive system as composed of the heart, left lung, liver, stomach, large intestine, and small intestine. Becoming a bit more interesting as a system, Hartley proposes that the digestive tract is, quote, essentially an open-ended tube that runs from mouth to anus. Hartley goes on to propose that although the digestive system is within the body, that it directly relates to substances on the exterior of the body because it, quote, brings the external environment within and releases it out again. Tolentino's over-consuming body demonstrates how bodies can take and can take and can take. Yet when viewed choreographically and taking into consideration the movements of the insides of the body, Honey both connotates that empire is endlessly lush and consumable, and that there is as much spitting, shitting, and sweating out as taking in. The evocation of the insides of the body render these processes invisible, impossible to fully know, just like the complex workings of empire. Within the enveloped setting of US 21st century empire, empire is re-enveloped in the inside of the body. The place and space of empire is taken in, spit out, and excreted. And I'll pause here just to make a brief connection between this idea of empire as never ending, which anytime I send a paper out that has that in, I always get back the feedback that, Jay, that's too intense. That means that we are not even taking on an idea that empire could ever be over. So I instead use ongoing. And then I'll make a sort of comparison to the difference between durational art, which is how we've been discussing what is sometimes called endurance art. And I think there's a similar quality of the idea of a stop that comes with duration as opposed to endurance, which is something that you have to keep reckoning with. So in closing, queer duration and the linger of imperialism. Honey is a choreography of the inside of the body, which exposes the excessive capitalist and consumerist workings of US 21st century empire. Tolentino's engagement with the inside of their body, vis-a-vis honey in particular, exposes the hyper-consumptive aspects of empire in ways that render queer resistance not just possible, but possibly thriving. In closing, I want to posit that queerness and queer art, much of what we are here doing this weekend, as resilient and always able to endure the seemingly ongoing duration of empire's excessive consumption. Yet the context of a queer durational performance with a beginning and an end also models a hard stop and hard refusal of US empire's workings. The consumption is at once excessive and overdone, but finite, kind of always happening, but also distinctly over. Thank you. So we're gonna shift now into responses to one another. I'm not gonna go first. I'll put that on someone else. And in a moment, we will open up for questions from the audience.
What'd you think, Leon?
Great.
Could I ask
Yeah.
how I really loved your piece, and I wanted to ask how you were thinking about it and in putting it together? Because
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the archive, I mean, one of the things that's been, I think one of our goals for the semester a little bit was to think about the archive of this practice and its duration. And I think that was a little bit of the work of the class as well that you were teaching, Julie. And, you know, she just sent me a PowerPoint file that has many decades of work compiled in it, and I started going through it and was having such of, you know, as was clear, emotional response, and so I just thought that I would write down things that were occurring to me, and I actually want to keep going with it. So, but you know, I also think it's important that the work gets contextualized, right, and put in the context of this incredibly rich practice. I mean, honey has had a really obviously important circulation and visibility, and I think it's maybe interesting to think about like why that is, as opposed to other aspects of the practice. But you know, it obviously emerges from an incredibly distinctive perspective, you know, context and history. So, and also just seeing the kind of aesthetic motifs, right, in the work that I think are consistent, thinking about like the line, for example, and just formally, right, like what's going on and where does the color gold come in, right? Where all these are sort of like basic kind of questions that looking at the work in the full context, seems to ask. So that was kind of how I was thinking about it, yeah.
I was really struck by what we share across our papers, but I guess that's the shared training. I love that we both went Renaissance.
Yes.
I feel like I can't look at a golden beam of light without thinking. We can go to questions from the audience. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go to questions from the audience.
And there's mics, yeah.
Thank you all so much. While we've been listening to your papers and thinking about Julie's work, we're engaging with it through performance documentation with photography, and I would love to hear in your research and just doing the deep dive, especially with Honey, and like working with Julie's archive of ephemera as well, Leon, like what is the role of cameras in Julie Tolentino's live performance work or documentation in relationship to your studies? I'd be really interested to hear about that.
Well, maybe I could start. Yeah, it is such a really important question, I think. I think, there is a real shift from the work that's documented on film, for example, to the digital documentation. There's just a different texture that really places it historically in, the particular moments that it moves through. So yeah, I think like thinking about the medium specificity of how the documentation was made, and how that locates it in time. She does have performances for camera, so there are certain pieces that are oriented toward the lens, right? The aperture of the camera, and others that are made for performance. And I think the whole question of documentation is really vexed because often that's the only access that most people will have to the work if they aren't able to see it live, but also essential, right? I mean, it's so important. And I don't know, I guess that like vexedness is itself interesting and significant. Yeah, other things to add?
I think maybe related, something I've been thinking about too is that the most recent last performance had the 5 monitors that were placed around the room that were just only a camera on the line of gold. And so it felt like this like live, bless you, it felt like this like live feed of watching the little globes fall down the line. I wasn't sure if that was recorded actually, or if that was just like a live feed that it was recorded. Okay, so I think about how that documentation is its own special other kind of trace of it, in that we don't see Julie or Pigpen, and I wonder what it would be like to get to years from now watch only that feed of the globes. Because the first time I saw the performance, I didn't know, I wasn't paying attention to like the way that Julie wanted the globes to be a particular way that went down the line. So it indirectly answers the question where I've been thinking about that, those monitors and that filming, and how it'll add this other dimension to how the performance is remembered and documented. Not to mention having my own photos that like circulated on Tumblr and like exist in the Tumblr sphere, which I also think are important in my opinion. But yeah.
Yeah, to jump in, like Letty, I hadn't seen it before this version, which has been a deep regret in my life because I was at the Stanford conference when it happened, and I've been for like a decade and some years now. Been like, why didn't I go to that? Like, what was I doing during this time? So I've been with the images for a very long time, and was similar to you, really struck by what it was like to encounter it in the live. It also was not at all what I thought it was going to be. And that experience shifted how I was thinking about it as a work quite profoundly. And I think in relationship to your question, I think a lot about with the documentation, the kind of close-ups that, yes, I wasn't thinking of the beads as much as I was thinking of the mouth, because that was what I was talking about, that you can see in the photos, like a little bit of the actual motion. So there's a way in which the documentation, I don't know, allows us to, get different perspectives that the eye in a performance would do automatically. And it's actually, at least what we've been showing here, like quite good. In rotation, I would hesitate to say just one photo could do it all.
I find photography a really useful research tool. I mean, just to say the obvious, but perhaps less vexed for me, Leon, someone who thinks of themselves more as a visual culture scholar, both for thinking through very purposeful composition, but I also think artists are really attuned to documentation. And for me, the growing archive, or I should say the multimedial archive, right, offers an extension of the kind of archival work that is at the heart of Tolentino's practice. In a way that I find really pushes the way that I think about, or continues the work of pushing the way that we think about archives, performance, and documentation. And I'm not sure that I have strong feelings about a preferred mode of mediation, like it's all mediated and it's all really carefully thought through by the artist. So I find it useful and evocative.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks, Julie. And I know you were kind of joking about the shared training and the similarities, but I did actually want to follow up on that because, sorry, just because I think there was a lot of commonalities, but also differences, even internal to your presentations, and maybe just to say what was striking to me was the sort of emphasis on the quite specific material instantiation of the performance, like the muscular and exoskeletal, the choreography of the finger, right? These very specific kind of it is what it is sorts of readings, and then also things not seen, Asian American foodways or empire, this archive behind it, and so on. So I guess I wanted to, the sublime, right? A lot of things that are not just about the arch of the finger, the S of the mouth, and so on. So I wondered if maybe anybody wanted to reflect on that. It seemed like maybe there was something about the the durational itself, which would allow for a sort of switching back and forth, maybe in terms of the inside of the outside of the body, or kind of seeing what's before you versus speculation, or and it's partly about trying to imagine what it's like to experience it inside of it, but it's also about the experience of being a spectator, obviously, and the duration of that. So I know it's a bit vague and big, but it was really striking to me about the ways that you guys were coming at the performance, kind of allegorically and literally. I've been in the Barbara Johnson archive, so I was thinking about her a lot. Okay, yeah, that's it.
I mean, since I made the joke, I do think. Are you also NYU Performance Studies? Yeah, yeah. I mean, there is a literal shared training at NYU, and while my degree is in American Studies, one of my co-chairs was Jose Munoz, and I also think we share Munoz, and um, there was and also a genealogy. Like Summer was my student for the very first class that I TA'd as a doctoral student.
And she forgets, but she was the one who told me to apply for performance studies for grad school.
So I do also think that there is an approach to our objects of study that, at least for me, as I recall it, that is led by a kind of thick description or close reading of what we see that then guides us to our argument, and reaching for the theoretical tools to more aptly describe what it is that we see. So maybe that's you're noting the move from the particular or the specific to what is not seen, right? That heuristic that might help us arrive at an explication of our observation, right? So that's maybe a place to start, that it feels like a very specific modality that I was trained in, right? As an approach, not only to performance, but to the vision, to our objects of study, yeah.
That's such a great question. Thank you. I think there is something about the experience of watching durational performance that, yes, one's mind does tend to wander to what is this about, right? And the aboutness, and then one sort of ruminates. And then one has questions about the rumination as like, wait a minute, should I not be trying to think about what this is about, right? Should I not be trying to place it within an analytical framework that goes beyond what it's just doing, right? And in that way, it's funny, I was interviewed by the newspaper here, and they were like, what is this performance about? And I had a crisis because I was like, and yeah, I tried to sort of hedge my bets a little bit. And I think, yeah, I found myself just going to the descriptive, I guess. But I think that's true, that there's something about the durational that, and the static. I mean, of course, it's not static at all, but like the fact that there's a single image, right? That's, that you're looking at for 3 hours, that does invite sort of rumination in that way, and then sort of doubts about that rumination, and then maybe for me anyway, just a return to the thing itself.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that. When I heard your question, thank you. I'm thinking also a lot about sort of the legacy of how we've thought about body art or durational art, which comes out of the 1960s and postmodernism, and how I feel like our shared training had a distinct shift from taking that out of only comparing it to visual art, and that it's really been satisfying being on this panel with you all, because we have arrived at almost like a second generation of scholars who are looking at those things, again, not just in relationship to painting or sculpture. So I see that happening as well.
I would only want to add too that I think not only is it like, I like the idea that inevitably your mind wanders watching a durational performance, and then you're thinking about what is it about, but also I just think in terms of mentors and how a part of that training is also pedagogy. And so I like thinking about like what it is you're also, it sounds corny, but like what you're also like learning and that it might not have to be about the aboutness, but it actually is like, what are these other things? And that's why that Barbara Johnson quote, or like how Johnson writes about pedagogy, I wanted to think about it in this context of also finding it so, just thinking about Julie as a teacher in the classroom, but also in the performances, and like what lessons are there. And I do feel like that is, yeah, I guess I would say I think that is a part of the lineage or the that thinking too, of like you activate the object in the writing or the thinking, but also like what is it teaching? Again, that sounds corny, but I guess that's like what I'm thinking.
So we're approaching time. I think we can take one more question if someone has one burning in the back row, maybe.
Hi friends. Thank you all so much. What gorgeous reflections. I have a question surrounding something that I just felt threaded across each of your reflections in what felt like honey, both performance and substance, and all or none of the above lends itself to an excess or sensuality beyond the self. And I'm thinking with Kila Wazana Tompkins as well, queer elementarity that understands the mouth and orality as a site of non-normative desire. Summer, you beautifully offered us spoilage as this framing, as always wanting more. I'm thinking about what lingers in want, the duration, pleasure, unfulfillment of want. And you noted how Pigpen decides how much Julie can take, and it feels like there's a relinquishment of control. And Julie last night spoke of a dissolve that extends beyond the self. So I'd love to hear how you're making sense of this. And Letty, you beautifully offered us grief work and the sublime and care of the self, and thinking with Foucault and care of the self as social and relational necessarily extends beyond the self, and thinking through these mechanisms of grief work and distribution of vulnerability, and also choreographies of inside the body. So I'd love to hear more about how honey lends itself to an excess that necessarily exceeds the self. Thank you.
That was really lovely. Thank you.
Yeah.
And this is like I think related, or I don't know, but I was thinking also about something that was happening before Honey had started this past time, that Julie and Pigpen were practicing dripping the honey. I think you were like timing how much like each bottle of honey took. But there was this like side moment where I heard Julie like reminding Pigpen that they had to be specific kinds of globes. And Pigpen was like, okay. And then was getting them right. And I heard Julie say, I keep saying Julie, but looking at Julie and saying I'm wanting to say you, but hearing Julie say like, those are great globes, good job. And like, that was like another, I feel like another added part of what communication is happening, right? That it's like that in the performance, she talks about and thinks about the kind of suffering that she endures, but that even like right before it, she's in the place of getting to like offer this like affirmation of like, good job for the globes, like right before. So I don't know if that's another like moment that I was thinking about that I really liked getting to overhear.
It's a great question, Estefa. Thank you. And I have so many thoughts. But I do think that you're right in suggesting that there's something about honey itself that lends itself to thinking about the excessive. You know, like I remember after we saw it, we were all like thinking about like the excessive chain of signification, right? Like it's a humectant, but also acidic. It is, you know, like I think of it as curative, right? Like it was a prime medicine for me growing up, but you know, also like a multi-species or collaborative or collective production that, at least for me, really lends itself to also thinking about fear. I immediately think of the Candyman and hordes of bees. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like it's just so rich. And then of course the excessive is a really kind of important texture in the performance itself, right? And the ways that the excessive is tied to racialization or gendering or sexuality in a particular way that lends itself to the kind of queer project that I think we're all thinking through. So I think that suggestion or provocation is really generative and maybe what brings us together across our papers. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about how bees make honey, but bees make honey with flowers and they don't make honey alone, right? So there's a bit of an us that happens automatically in the substance, and I would say an us that happens in the fact of it being a performance that, again, that, requires a certain amount of like talking about or being with others in order for it to happen in its fullness. So I think that's it for now. Just a reminder to